But what was most important is I got to see boys like this who were close to death and who would have died if they'd been in their own villages. And then I got to see boys like this who had their surgery, who literally days after their surgery were running around, laughing, with a completely new life. And what's fantastic is in that centre I was seeing kids from this boy was from Kenya, but people from Iraq, all around the world. And again, it's a beautiful thing to bring back all these different countries, all these different cultures coming together, and everybody leaving with the same thing, which is a chance at life again, a chance they wouldn't have without the work that Emergency was doing there. When I was there, I got in a long conversation with Gino about Afghanistan, and I always said I would never go there to take photographs because I personally never really want to go to a place where other photographers work, because I think, well, what's the point? But we talked a lot about the emergency hospital there and the work that they were doing with civilian casualties, and the fact that really nobody else does that. I mean, it's a fact that I've repeated again and again and again until probably I've lost my voice. But in the 10 years that the Western forces have been there, they haven't built one functioning hospital, which is an incredible thing when you think 600 billion has been spent fighting the war. We're there supposedly for nation building, and yet we haven't managed to build one functioning hospital. So as I heard about the work that Emergency was doing there, and the hospital in Kabul and the other centres around the country, I made a promise that I would return and go to Afghanistan to take the pictures. And unfortunately, when I was there in Afghanistan a few months after I took this picture, I got injured myself. So it was 2 years before I was finally able to get back there and get to the emergency hospital in Kabul. It was a very emotional moment for me, actually, reaching that hospital. It felt somehow like coming home. As I say, all my work has always been with NGOs, and out of all those NGOs, it's always been Emergency that's felt closer. When I was injured, they were in contact, head office in Milan, straight away with my family. And throughout my rehabilitation, they'd always been supportive and encouraging about the possibility of going back to work. And when I suggested going back to Afghanistan to carry on my work, immediately they wanted me to carry on. Whereupon I think a lot of people might have discouraged me. I said, I think my girlfriend wished they had discouraged me. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of the people I saw in the hospital, and just another reminder of why the work done there is so important and must carry on. Here's a boy that was shot. As he sat at his aunt's house one evening, there was a fight going on between the Taliban and the American forces, and a bullet came through the house and struck him through the shoulder and then through the jaw. As is the case in many of the situations, you can't leave the house because there's fighting going on. It's not as simple as just calling an ambulance. There is no help like that. So his aunts were left with him. His aunts were screaming, didn't know what to do. They couldn't call anybody to come and help. And so for the whole night he just lay there bleeding, with his aunts doing the best they could to support him. His dad managed to get there in the morning. He wasn't able to be helped by the local American base, which again is a common story. So his family had to drive him to the emergency hospital in Kabul. I just wanted to mention this case. Again, it's an example of the work the emergency does, but also an example of what happens because of the lack of facilities. This was a young man called Muhammad Ali. He'd been working on the border with Iran, and like many young men of his age, crossing the border to try and find work. At one point he got shot as he was crossing. He was held by the Iranians for a couple of weeks, who didn't treat his wound, then released. And by the time he actually got to the hospital, it had been nearly 3 weeks. And by then the wound you can see in his leg had become incredibly infected. The staff there were doing everything they could to save it, but literally every day it was a case of almost tipping out, and just this fluid would come out from the infection. So in the end it was decided that he would have to have his leg amputated. This is the moment really where he's receiving the news that his leg has to be taken. His father actually had to give the final permission, because in Afghanistan, if you were going to be the person caring for the person, even if they're older, you have to give the final permission. And his father described it as giving his son a death sentence, because he said without his leg, he won't work, he won't marry. He'll probably end up destitute, without really a future. But with basic medical care, if he'd been able to get to hospital quick, that wouldn't be the case. He would still have his life. Here's another example of a common story you hear in Afghanistan. This was a young boy that had been walking to school when, again, a fight started between the Taliban and the Americans. He hid behind a wall, and the Americans threw a grenade over the wall. Fareed was hiding behind there when the grenade went off. He suffered severe stomach lacerations, wounds to the head. At the time the American soldiers left him there, his dad got to him and drove him to the American base. At the American base, the soldiers said they wouldn't treat him because they said he could be Taliban, despite the fact he was only 12 years old. So his dad then had to drive him through roadblocks with the threat of IEDs to finally get him to the hospital in Kabul, where he was treated. What struck me about Fareed, I mean, we became friends, but even after a couple of weeks of kind of hanging out with him and having fun, all I could see was the anger in his eyes, the anger of the situation. And, you know, I don't want to get into the rights and wrongs of this particular war. I mean, I obviously think most wars are wrong. But if you are fighting a war, if you are prosecuting a war, you have a duty of care to the civilians caught up in it. It seems to me incredible that we fight a war in a country, the civilians are injured in it, whether it be by us or by the Taliban, and yet we don't look after them, we don't care for them. My understanding of the war in Afghanistan, again, I'm not going to get into the rights and wrongs of it, but my understanding of the war is we went there to do two things. One is to create more safety for us from terrorists, and the other was to help stabilise the country. I can't help thinking when I meet people like Fareed that all we're doing is creating people that hate us even more. We're creating a new generation of people injured by our fighting, who we don't then help, who grow up with incredible anger. I think that neither stabilises the country or makes me feel safer in this one. Here's another example of many of the cases that are taken in the emergency hospital. This is Sedakola. He was quite a character. His dad was from the Panjshir Valley. I'm not sure if you're aware of the Panjshir Valley, but it's a place in Afghanistan that has never been conquered. The British in the 1870s never conquered it, the Russians never conquered it, the Taliban never conquered it. The men are very strong and very proud, and according to a couple of the nurses I was with, apparently they're very handsome there as well. But I wouldn't know about that. But this was Sedakola, and he'd, again, one of the most common cases is children picking up unexploded devices, picking up shiny objects, and getting their hands blown up. It's a simple case in both Afghanistan and most war-torn countries. It's the children that are poor that suffer the most. Children especially, because they're the ones going to schools, they're the ones out collecting firewood, they're the ones out playing in the fields. They, despite their education, tend to pick things up and those things often go off in their hands. Sedakola had actually found a bomb and taken the fuse out and then lit it to see what would happen, which then went off in his hands. It seems a ridiculous thing to do, but I thought about it myself and I was thinking, well, when I was 10, 11 years old, it's probably the kind of thing I would have done. Anyway, he had lost the ends of his fingers